All trains have a starting point and a last stop on the line. Typically, when they reach that last stop, they turn around and start heading back in the other direction. Not all trains make it back home, though. Sometimes the last stop in the line really is the final call they make, and they become abandoned to time and nature. On some occasions, that final stop can arrive long before the train is ready to retire. The region of Perm in Russia is famous for its natural beauty, but there's nothing natural about the relics which are hiding in the forest here. These long-forgotten steam locomotives are relics of the Second World War, during which they were used to carry coal to support the war effort. When the war was over, they no longer had a purpose to serve, and so they were dragged out into the forest to collect rust. Some effort was made to preserve them, with moving parts wrapped in oiled paper to protect them from the elements, but it's doubtful anything could get these old engines started again now. The best-looking trains were taken to museums a few years ago, but it seems nobody wants to exhibit the rusty old trains that have been left behind. They're still watched over, though. Guards from a nearby warehouse keep an eye out to make sure that nobody tries to scavenge them for scrap metal. A well-designed train carriage can have a life long before it's no longer useful on the rails. Newer models of engine and carriage may appear, but that doesn't mean that an old carriage has to be thrown out. Not when there are inventive minds who can put it to better use. In Georgia, this rusting old carriage has been reimagined as a bridge, providing crossing from one side of a river to another. Nobody knows who put this here or how. There isn't a railway line near the remote location and no visible sign of the carriage being dragged across the fields. Whoever put it here meant it to stay fixed in place. The edges of the carriage have been welded to steel posts to make sure it doesn't slip out of place. Sadly, it looks like it's beginning to fall apart now. Holes have appeared in the floor of the carriage. We think it might be safer to swim across than use this unconventional walkway. The tunnel which connects Great Britain to France, and therefore the European mainland, took years and billions of dollars to complete. The high-speed trains which run through the special tunnel cost millions of dollars to build. So who would carelessly abandon one outside Valenciennes in France? The battered and broken old train is a Eurostar 373018, which started running in 1994 and traveled from London through France to Brussels at almost 200 miles per hour in its prime. But the model was retired from service in 2016. The fleet was supposed to go into storage, but this doesn't look like storage to us. It's been left out in the open, attracting vandals and graffiti artists. It's even home to a few birds, who have decided that the unwanted train is the perfect place to build a nest and lay some eggs. Most trains of this class have now been scrapped and recycled, so perhaps in comparison to that, becoming a multicolored birdhouse is a better fate for this old Eurostar. Trains can only move when there's a track for them to move along. When a storm comes along and washes away the track, they're stuck. If someone then decided that the old trains aren't worth rebuilding the tracks for, then they're doomed to stay where they are forever. That's how this train graveyard was accidentally created on the outskirts of Nome in Alaska, USA. This is actually an abandoned railroad in an abandoned old mining town called Solomon, which the locals refer to as the last train to nowhere, and love telling spooky ghost stories about. In 1903, the trains here took miners to and from work after a gold strike in Ophir. It wasn't a long line. It only ran for 25 miles and was focused on serving workers rather than the public. The gold strike wasn't anything like as profitable as the builders and miners had hoped for, and the company running the trains collapsed in 1907. 5 years later, a huge storm destroyed the tracks, leaving these rusting relics in situ for over a century. It would seem that ghost towns are good places to find ghost trains, because there are also a whole bunch of them to be found in the Australian town of Maree, population 150. The tiny town lost its railway connection in 1986 when it was deemed to be commercially non-viable, and it looks like nobody could be bothered to come to this remote location and collect the 3 NSU-class locomotives which were stationed at Maree Railway Station when the decision was made. They've been stood stock still for more than 30 years, But considering all the time that's passed, they're still in a good state of repair. For many years, the locals have insisted that the old station is haunted, with the most popular of all the ghost stories being one of a driver who's frequently seen in the cab of one of the 3 trains, waiting for an order to move which will never come. This next abandoned train isn't so much an abandoned piece of equipment as an abandoned idea, and one which started with eccentric British inventor George Benny in the 1920s. Benny came up with the concept of the railplane, a vehicle which carried passengers on rails like a train, but had a propeller and traveled above the ground like a plane. Benny imagined that existing railway lines could be extended upwards, allowing his new invention to carry passengers faster than the traditional trains running below them, which would be relegated to cargo duty. A prototype vehicle and track were built and successfully demonstrated, but the idea didn't catch on. He was eventually forced to sell the parts of his railplane for scrap, but that didn't stop Joseph Archer trying the idea in France 3 decades later. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't sell the public on the idea either. Had fate not intervened in the shape of a badly timed earthquake, Russians could be traveling by maglev trains far and wide by now. The idea of trains that run above the rails by harnessing the power of magnetism has been talked about as the science of the future for decades now. But Russia had a version of them working and in service 30 years ago. Project Wagon TA-05 was capable of over 150 miles per hour and started transporting paying customers in 1986. If the trial run had been successful, it might well have been rolled out across the whole of the Soviet Union. Regrettably, the aforementioned earthquake that hit Armenia 2 years later destroyed much of the track and the equipment, forcing tests to be abandoned and necessitating millions of dollars worth of repair work. The repair work was never done, and Wagon TA-05 has to be seen as a missed opportunity for all concerned. There's another way you can make trains levitate that doesn't involve magnets. You can have them running on cushions of air. That was the big dream of French designer Jean Bertin. And like the team behind the Russian Wagon TA-05, he almost turned his dream into a successful reality. From 1965 to 1977, Bertin conducted painstaking speed and safety tests on his Aerotrain project using a specially conducted test track which ran from Rouen to Saran, close to Châteauvieux in France. 2 prototype trains were built at great cost to the French government, who were never quite happy with the results of the tests. An increasingly frustrated Bertin passed away after over a decade of testing, with the French government no closer to approving his grand idea. In the end, they decided to go with high-speed TGV trains and scrap Bertin's idea. The original test tracks are still standing, a testament to another chance missed for futuristic travel. Is our next abandoned train a reality or a myth? We may be able to find out. For decades, there have been rumors that a train full of gold was abandoned in secret tunnels below Lower Silesia in Poland as the Second World War drew to a close. The stories say that a network of tunnels and mines was created below the surface for future use by the Nazis, into which the train was driven, carrying over 300 tons of gold, along with priceless art and jewelry. They intended to return for it once the war was won. Obviously, they never did. Many searches for the train were carried out for 50 years after the war ended, but nothing was found. Now it looks like there may be something there after all. Miners Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, using information gleaned from the deathbed confession of a Nazi construction worker, obtained ground radar readings that appear to show a cavern beneath the ground at a location specified by the worker. Initial digs found nothing, but further scans revealed 7 more cavities below the earth, believed to be a railway tunnel, at a depth of 65 feet in 2017. It was confirmed that drilling down to this depth would begin as of late 2018, but is yet to commence. Is the lost Nazi gold haul about to be found? What most people who lived through it remember about the Cold War is that it was a time of great tension, and a military arms race as both sides stockpiled weapons. And among all the fear, though, it was a time of great technological experimentation and advancement. As an example, here's a jet-powered train developed by the Soviet side. With two huge engines strapped onto the roof of the train, it was hoped that speeds of up to 160 miles per hour could be achieved. That would be considered fast for trains now. Back in the 1970s, it would have been revolutionary. Remarkably, it achieved its target speed, but at a completely impractical cost. The fuel consumption of the jet engines was enormous, and it would have made no financial sense to try to put the trains into full service, and so the prototype was abandoned despite its relative success. Initially, it was nicely framed and ornately decorated for storage, but now it's a rusting old shell. Great Britain is synonymous with the dawn of the age of steam trains, and some of the early models are now museum pieces in their home country. If you want to see a vast collection of them all in the same place without paying for entry, though, you might need to head on out to the plains of Bolivia. This is Cementerio de Trains, near Uyuni, also known as the Great Train Graveyard. Uyuni is a connection point between several major South American cities by rail, and in the early 20th century, there were plans to make the station and rail facilities even larger. Hundreds of trains were ordered and shipped from Britain, but then negotiations about price and logistics for construction for the expanded transport hub broke down. No agreement could be reached, and the trains were no longer required. Some of them were scrapped, but more than 100 of them were left exactly where they were pulled to upon arrival in the country. Graffiti covering many eras and political causes appears on the side of some of the trains, but the majority have been heavily corroded by the salt winds in the area. The Orient Express is more than just a train route. It's an idea. The words Orient Express for over a century meant the highest standard of luxury in transport on rails. Buying a ticket to ride on an Orient Express service was a statement about your wealth and status. It's almost unthinkable that the type of train that once provided such a service would be left to rot. But here one of them is in Belgium. It's important to note that this particular train never ran the classic Orient Express route from Paris to Istanbul, but it's a Type 620, the same build and model of train which made the Orient Express journeys. It was moved to its current location in preparation for a railway museum to be built, but years have passed and there's still no railway museum. That's left the exterior rusting and rotting away, although footage and photos gathered by urban explorers offer us a glimpse of the splendor that once existed within. Hopefully someone gets on with the work of building that museum before there's nothing left of the train left to put inside it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.